talking about conversational participants. Conversational principles presented so far have neglected to say much about whom the participants in the conversation might be. So this section focuses mostly about who are making the conversation. So these participants could conceivably influence the nature of conversational process. So for example, the nature such as their age, their gender, their social status, their ethnic backgrounds, and even the degree of friendship or intimacy are factors that could influence certain conversations and their natures. So one topic that we will consider is exactly how speakers and addressees adapt to one another. So generally, speakers are able to adjust their speech in light of particular characteristics, such as particular characteristics of the addressee, such as political interest. For example, if you're a Democrat and who you're speaking to is a Republican, you would usually try to adjust to each other's preferences and how you would speak to one another, how you would talk to one another, and your certain political exploits. And also, the speaker's perception of the group as a whole. So for example, if you're talking to younger listeners, you would be speaking in a different way than if you were talking to, let's say, professionals or older people. Now, however, these speakers do not always or routinely make these adaptations. Thus, we are so far from a complete understanding of how and when speakers make conversational adjustments. So, there are exactly two areas of research in this endeavor of conversational participants. The first area of research focuses on the differences in conversational processes when speaking to friends and acquaintances or even strangers. And the next area of research focuses on effects of gender on conversation. So whether you're a male or a female, and most of the research are strictly unisex, so they don't have the gays or they don't have other genders apart from male and female. So for the first area of research, we will be talking about friends and acquaintances. So what's a very important concept that needs to be understood when talking about conversation between friends and acquaintances is the concept of common ground. Now, common ground refers to the shared understanding of those involved in the conversation. So for example, there's person A. Person A knows given information X, and person B must also know information X. And person A must understand that person B knows this information, and vice versa. So there's a shared understanding that they both know this certain information. It's like when you're talking to a friend in the same class. When you're talking about psychology and you're both in that class, you have a shared understanding and you both know the same concepts, the same information, and you are able to connect because of that common ground. Now, common ground, they can be culturally based or personally based. So culturally based, these are based on cultural values, commonly held beliefs, or culturally prescribed roles. Now, these are conversations that happen when you spot a fellow Filipino or seeing other relatives overseas, because these are culturally based and you have a shared culture, which makes it your common ground. However, it is personal common ground that is our concern at this point, and there are a different amount of research that focuses on personal common ground. One of the research was conducted in 2004, and it examined how common ground may influence conversational processes. So in this research, participants worked in pairs as the director instructed a builder on how to assemble certain Lego models. In one group, directors could directly see the builder's workspace. So they could see how the builder was working, they could somehow give cues, while the other group, the director did not see their builders and instead only gave instructions via audio tape. So as you can see, it was shown that the first group, the one where directors were able to directly see the builders, they were much faster. Why? This is because they were able to communicate with each other via head nods, eye gazes, and head shakes. So the conclusion is conversation proceeds much more smoothly when we have the ability to monitor others. Apart from that, friends, by definition, have a great deal more common ground than acquaintances or strangers. This is because friends have a certain shared knowledge that is not present when you have conversation with acquaintances. This shared knowledge might influence several other conversational processes. One such example is like how we close conversations. We need ways to close off certain conversational topics. We can't just leave topics hanging. There has to be a way that we can close it and come into terms with what we just talked about. So for example, you have a friend and you're both on the phone. When you're talking to a friend on a phone about an upcoming trip to the friend's house, we might make some preliminary arrangements. Like, for example, you already talk about the time that you're going to arrive or time of arrival. You also talk about the duration of your stay. But it is possible that you don't talk about anything else other than that because there's a shared knowledge that you jointly agree that you can complete these plans later. Like, who are you going with? Or what else are you going to bring? This is what common ground is for. The ability to close off a topic of discussion for now actually depends on how much common ground that you have with your conversational partner. You can jointly agree that you can complete the plans later even though you don't explicitly say so. This discussion would have likely been longer and less successful if we were to have it with someone we were less acquainted with or we didn't even know. So, empirical research has actually examined some of the differences between friends and acquaintances in terms of how they talk to one another. So, for example, Planalp had students make conversational communication with a friend and with an acquaintance, and he made them record them on an audio tape. There were some very clear differences that occurred. So for example, if you go with a friend, he noticed that they were more likely to use profanity, such as, well, you can see, and they were able to laugh more often, or they were able to express negative judgments like they don't like this person or they don't like this certain class. They were more free to actually talk about these things, and they were also more prone to arguing, so they would debate. And there was also joint references to themselves, such as we or us. This was all present in their conversations with friends. However, for acquaintances, you can quite see that there's not much to talk about. There were more pauses, those awkward ums and uhs and so forth, and usually they only talked about one topic when, in comparison to friends, they talked about a multitude of topics and they were able to express themselves more freely. So you can see here, friends obviously have a greater degree of common ground than acquaintances. So it wasn't really a surprise that their shared knowledge would influence the kinds of conversations and how it would influence these conversations. So for example, friends were more likely to refer to other people and events without explaining who or what they were. So you can refer to your best friends. Remember those times when you had a crush on someone and you just say siya or him or he, or even have some certain weird nicknames about them. But your friends would understand because you had common ground about it. And friends were also more likely to make references to past encounters. Obviously, you can't do this if you were talking to a stranger because you didn't have any past encounters. And friends were also more likely to talk about habits and plans. Most likely because friends, well, you're gonna plan to see them again in the future. Unlike in acquaintances, you're not really sure if you're going to see them after your conversation. So, there was a Hornstein research back in 1985 where he analyzed phone conversations between friends, acquaintances, and strangers and found a number of differences. So for friends, obviously it will be much more rich than your conversation with strangers. Friends were more likely to use more implicit openings. Hi, it's me versus good day, my name is. If it's your friend, you would know exactly that you're talking to your friend on the phone. You won't have to explain that it's you, or you won't really have to explain your name. Unlike if you were an acquaintance and you were talking to strangers, of course you would have to introduce yourself. Those phone conversations with friends also held more topics, had more questions, and had more complex closings. Unlike with acquaintances and strangers, they were typically how you would talk to with acquaintances or strangers. There were less topics, there were less questions, and their closings were much more simple. So the conclusion is, common ground allows us to condense speech. So consider this following exchange between friends. So K says, "What do you buy men in your family for Christmas?" B says, "My father is the main problem." K says, "Yes, I have that same problem. I finally resorted to saying, 'Dad, what do you want?' 'I don't need anything.' B, "That's exactly the same thing. I think we have the same father." So you can see from this conversation, when you see it, you clearly know which quotation was from the dad and which quotation was from K. But if you were only listening to it, you might have a harder time. But B was able to catch this immediately. B was able to understand immediately which quote came from K and which quote came from the dad. This is what common ground does. It condenses the speech. It makes it easier for you to understand exactly what's being talked about without much reference to what it is. Generally, these studies suggest friends operate on the basis of implicit assumptions, more than strangers or acquaintances. So let's talk about gender differences in conversation. The first part talked mostly about friends versus acquaintances. But according to studies, there has been considerable amount of research that has investigated the question of whether or not there are certain gender differences in conversational processes. So this discussion is organized historically. So we'll be focusing more on early work, and then we will be focusing later on the more recent research. So for early work, we have Sachs and colleagues. So Sachs and colleagues claim that we have several rules for holding conversations. Like, one such rule is that the current speaker has power to select the next one, and another speaker may self-select by speaking up when pause occurs. So they suggest that these rules minimize the degree of conflict between participants. Now, Zimmerman and West had a study in 1975, and they examined whether these rules hold equally well for conversations between men and women as opposed to those with either just men or just women. So they tape recorded them and transcribed conversations in natural settings such as coffee shops and drugstores. And they identified 3 important speech behaviors. So the first one is overlaps, the next one is interruptions, and the third one is minimal responses. Overlaps was defined as simultaneous speech during the last word of speaker's projected closing. So these overlaps were basically consistent with Sachs' rules, because Sachs' rules said, right over here, another speaker may self-select by speaking up when pause occurs. So this was consistent with Sachs' rules. Now, interruptions were a different story. These were defined as periods of simultaneous speech more than one word before speaker's projected completion point. Now, this one violates the speaker's turn, and obviously, it's a violation of Sachs' rules. Minimal responses now, these are remarks like and and all those other fillers that you use in order for the speaker to know that you're kind of listening. These weren't viewed as interruptions, but rather a display of interest in this topic. Now, Zimmerman and West's research found that 96 of interruptions were made by male speakers, and 10 of the 11 males interrupted at least once. In contrast, interruptions were less frequent and were symmetrically distributed in same-sex conversations. So 96% of the interruptions were made by male speakers when the woman was speaking. But this was equalized or distributed symmetrically when they were talking to men. A second major result was that many of the responses by males to female topics were delayed, minimal responses, in which a delay of several seconds occurred before the listener's minimal responses. So Zimmerman and West conclude that men deny equal status to women as conversational partners with respect to the rights to the full utilization of their turns and support for the development of topics. So this reflects the power difference between men and women in our culture. So Zimmerman and West created a second study, and this one actually further stated that the pattern of verbal interaction reflects the power difference between men and women in the culture. And this second study fully supported that. It found that children are treated by parents in ways that are similar to the ways women are treated by men in conversations. For example, 12 out of 14 interruptions in parent-child interactions in the physician's office were initiated by parents. In the first study, 10 of the 11 males interrupted at least once during a conversation. So there's almost a parallel between how parents interacted with their children and how males interacted with females when they were talking. These results fit well with other observations that were made about the same time. For example, Lakoff's study in 1975 argued that women's speech differs in a number of respects from men's speech. And they claimed that women's speech contains more linguistic expressions of uncertainty than men's speech does. So for example, women tend to use tag questions. It's awfully cold in here, isn't it? So there's not really an answer other than yes or no. So it's a tag question. They also tend to use hedges. Sort of, I guess. And they also tend to use more question intonation patterns in declarative sentences than men. For example, so we will meet at 8. So you can see the question intonation pattern, even though it's a declarative sentence that yes, you will meet at 8, but for some reason, it is said in a question intonation pattern. So this suggests a degree of uncertainty or lack of assertiveness in Lakoff's study. So several studies found that women use more linguistic devices that signal uncertainty than men. So this is very consistent with Lakoff's study. Now, similarly, Fishman analyzed conversation of men and female couples and found that women used more questions, attention-getting devices, minimal responses than men, and they also tended to use the phrase, you know, as in, did you know that, as a form of a conversational opening, more often than men. So Fishman concluded that women do the bulk of interactional work, and it reflects again the power asymmetry that was established by other studies that were discussed a while back. Early work emphasized the power differential, but what about the more recent work? The more recent work actually had a better time for disproving previous studies. So, for example, in recent years, some scholars within linguistics and other fields have questioned both the reliability of the foregoing results as well as the conclusions that have been drawn from them. So, consider first that the results. McMullen, Vernon, and Morton attempted to replicate Fishman's study, this one, and found very different results. For example, there were no differences in the use of questions, including tag questions, between men and women in the intimate couples that they observed, and nor did they observe any differences in the use of minimal responses. Thus, for more recent work, there is no evidence that women necessarily worked harder in their conversations than men. So, Simpkins, Bullock, and Wildman also found essentially similar results. Now, these linguistic differences do not always differentiate women and men because couples differ in the ways that they actually share power. For example, Kollock, Blumstein, and Schwartz studied cross-sex and same-sex couples in which either power was shared equally or was not shared equally. So they found that for couples in which one partner had more power, the more powerful partner would interrupt more, and the less powerful partner used more minimal responses and tag questions, and this is regardless of gender. But for those who shared the power, there were few differences in conversational behavior. So power dynamics can actually create conversational division of labor, usually attributed to sex. Sex by itself actually has very little or nothing to do with such division of labor. So it has more to do with how equally you share the power in the relationship than actual sex itself. So, for example, some questions have also been raised about the interpretation of gender differences that do appear. So, Tannen did a study on this, and he suggested that men and women come to mixed sex conversations with different assumptions and expectations, and that these differences could actually create some form of miscommunication. So, for example, let's have a problem. Let's say your problem is you want to pass a certain class. When you discuss a problem with a woman, and when you discuss a problem with a man, they have different responses, and they would have different assumptions and expectations on how you would approach this certain problem. So for instance, when women discuss a problem, men tend to interpret it as an invitation to help solve the problem. So if your problem is how am I going to pass this class, they would obviously, ganito kasi gawin mo, they'd give you suggestions, or according to the study at least, they would try to help you in this conversation. But if you were talking to a woman, the woman might respond instead by relating a problem of their own, like, same, I also have the same problem, I also need to know how to pass this class. So it was more on an emotional, relational level than the men's. So they had different assumptions and expectations, and this could of course cause some problems. Tannen suggested that women's language is not exactly inferior, but it's just different than how men speak. This view of women's language provides a different way of interpreting how we interpret conversational behavior. So for example, in Holmes, he actually tried to distinguish different kinds of tag questions. So because there are different kinds of tag questions because there are different functions of tag questions. So there's the modal function, and then there's the affective function. For the modal function of tag questions, it's the kind that requests assurance or reassurance, and it's a confirmation of information of which the speaker is uncertain of. So for example, you don't know what day it is. You'd ask, today's Tuesday, right? That's a tag question. Now, affective function is different because it expresses concern for the addressee and it attempts to facilitate conversation. So, for example, you want to have conversation with a certain someone and you would say something related to the weather, like, it's cold today, isn't it? It's different from the earlier tag question that says today's Tuesday, right? So there are different functions for tag questions. Holmes even said that although the latter remark might be expressing uncertainty, Holmes contends that the speaker is expressing an opinion and trying to solicit a response. So certain features ordinarily ascribed to women's speech may be an effective way of eliciting responses. Along these lines, it is worth noting that some evidence indicates that women who use more tentative language when discussing conversational topics are more likely to influence men's opinions. So let's talk about speaker interruptions. We've been talking about gender and power differentials. Now let's talk again about speaker interruptions that were first introduced in early work. So for speaker interruptions, there are actually kinds of speaker interruptions. So first one, there's a dominance-related interruption, and there's a supportive or cooperative-related interruption. For the dominance-related one, the listener attempts to take the floor. And it was observed that men are more likely to use dominance-related interruptions. For the supportive or cooperative related interruptions, the listener speaks simultaneously but not intrusively with the person who has the floor. So this is more in the domain of the women. They would be more prone to do this than the men. Speaker interruptions also state that the total number of interruptions may not be the most satisfactory way to measure conversational process. If so, the total number of interruptions may not be the most satisfactory way to measure these conversational processes. Perhaps we need to look more closely at the semantic content of these interruptions. Now let's talk about speech context. So there was a study where some dyads or some groups were given some formal tasks. Formal tasks are when you're asked to solve a problem or generating a group answer. And casual tasks where you're just trying to get to know someone but there's no specific task or topic to discuss. And it was found that males tend to interrupt more in formal tasks. Of course, there are many other aspects of male and female speech behavior, and they're quite salient in our everyday lives. So, however, an increased awareness of these conversational patterns may have changed the patterns themselves. So you can see from this presentation and the early work, they weren't exactly parallel to how recent work were getting results. So the increased awareness of these conversational patterns, they can change how we are conversing today. So in the 70s, they tended to replicate Zimmerman and West's results, the one with the power dominance of men in conversations. But in the 80s, they found no differences between men and women in conversations. However, some aspects of conversation may be fundamentally different. Let's talk about kinds of conversational turns. So Adelsky had a study of faculty committee meetings. Adelsky recorded the verbal behavior of men and women with the intention of studying conversational turn-taking. And he found that there were actually different kinds of conversational turns. So for example, some turns like this one, you had a clear speaker while others listened or responded. While this one, other turns were more collaborative in nature with several people sharing the turn. So this is like a group work, and then this one is more like a presentation. Now, we found for this one, this particular one, men took longer turns than women when there's only one clear speaker. But for this one, there were fewer differences between men and women. So in short, one contribution of studying gender differences in turn taking is that it forces us to rethink and redefine a fundamental conversational concept such as what exactly is a turn? I hope you learned much about conversational participants, strictly speaking, friends and acquaintances, and the role of gender in conversations. I hope you had a nice time on my part, and now we'll be